Hello, and welcome to the premiere episode of Theater XYZ, a podcast where people from three different generations, an X, a Y, and a Z, will be talking about different issues facing the theater industry today. We're your hosts, Bailey Sheehan, a Y.
Elizabeth Miller, an X.
And I'm Matt Faragasso, a Y, which you may also know as a millennial.
We'd like to welcome you to our show, but before we get started, we'd like to take this opportunity to respectfully acknowledge that we are hosting this podcast from the traditional lands of the Lenni Lenape people, and we pay our respects to elders both past and present.
Today, the Z joining us is Shaun McNulty, a student here at Lehigh University who has been involved with the Department of Theater in many roles. We also have special insights from David Holcomb, the production manager for the Carnegie Mellon University School of Drama. The topic we'll be discussing today is work-life balance, more specifically 10 out of 12s and the show must go on mentality.
Hi, I'm Shaun. Is that good? We'd like to share that we're here to learn and discuss, and that as people we can grow and our opinions can change. Nicole Brewer, an anti-oppressive theater educator and advocate, put it perfectly when she said the following during her workshop, Anti-Racist Theater, a foundational course. Recognize that we are both learning and unlearning, and while we are doing that, we are going to create harm. So giving ourselves the grace that allows ourselves to speak in draft, and knowing that that does not define who we are, that is not the last version of ourselves. This is really important towards forgiveness and building our shame resilience and being able to show up and do this work.
Thank you so much, Shaun. So today we're talking about work-life balance, the show must go on mentality, 10 out of 12s, and the 6-day work week. Our research is coming from four main sources: our own personal stories, confidential interviews with colleagues from different backgrounds, David Holcomb's insights, as well as the We See You White American Theater document. I would just like to take a second to say that the three of us are Lehigh University employees talking with a Lehigh University student, but this podcast and this issue in particular is not just a Lehigh problem. These are issues that span the entire theater industry, and our opinions or thoughts or perspectives are coming from many different experiences we faced in our careers. Elizabeth, would you care to explain what a 10 out of 12 is and what the show must go on mentality is?
Sure. So 10 out of 12 is where we, on our schedule of a day in theater, usually it's around the first day of our tech process, we will schedule a 12-hour day, and we will have 10 working hours scheduled on that 12-hour day. That gives us an hour break for lunch and an hour for dinner. And the show must go on mentality is the thinking pattern that we seem to have adopted in some point, I don't even know when, where we all think no matter what happens, this show must happen. So despite there may be an injury or somebody might be ill, the thinking is that we have to continue with the show. There's no stopping once the process is moving or once that event is scheduled for that day. And we sort of figure out any way we can, taking shortcuts to try and get that show done at any cost. It's become about making sacrifices.
So Matt, do you want to explain why we're addressing on a podcast about issues in the theater industry?
This was something that kind of came to the group organically. We were discussing having a podcast to meet and learn about faculty and staff at Lehigh, and something that came out of the conversation was, what if we talk about theater in a little more depth, and how can we address some of these other issues? And something that came out earlier this year was the We See You White American Theater document that addresses a lot of these social issues that people of color face regularly in the industry, and how some of these practices are outdated. So we thought it'd be a great chance to talk amongst colleagues and generations about social change and how we feel about these institutionalized themes and how we can change them and what they mean to us.
Can we define more what the We See You White American Theater document is?
Sure. So the We See You White American Theater, WAT, was a document created by an anonymous group of BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous people of color, created to point out the different injustices and how theater in America is a predominantly white institution, and only white people have been benefiting from it. So what this document is a 31-page list of demands in which they point out all the different ways that theater in general, and it also goes more into specifics of Broadway and unionized theaters and theater for profit and nonprofit theater, how they can become more to open the door to BIPOC people, because right now that door is very much shut. So it covers a ton of different topics, and on page 5, I believe, it talks about the work-life balance in theater and how it's incredibly exclusive to the BIPOC community, specifically Indigenous people who have suffered from genocide, and how having these really long work days, having a 6-day work week is pushing everyone who's not white out of the doors because they don't have the resources to be in a theater for possibly 14 hours a day. It's called 10 out of 12, but that can be a 14 or 16-hour day, particularly if you're in tech, if you're a stage manager. The 10 out of 12 specifically is about the working time for the actors, and that excludes tech. So that document basically outlines who is harmed from these practices and what we can do to fix them. Elizabeth had a friend named David Holcomb, who is the production manager at the Carnegie Mellon University School of Drama, who has effectively eliminated 10 out of 12s and they've made a true commitment to working towards fixing the work-life balance, particularly for their students. So we were able to interview him and see like the logistics of how to eliminate it, why they eliminated it, and the effects that they've seen.
It's really more about my continual concern for, at least in my context at Carnegie Mellon, my concern for the students' health and well-being, and seeing that this is a, practice that the industry uses that I feel is not particularly healthy for anybody. And our school was emulating that practice, more or less like a lot of schools do things to prepare people for the industry that they're going to be entering. But I thought, if I don't think the industry should be doing this, why should we be doing this?
So, Shaun, you're a student here at Lehigh. You work in the Department of Theater a lot. So would you like to share some of your experiences as a student in the theater department in terms of work-life balance, in terms of 10 out of 12s, and just the general feel you have?
Yeah, definitely. As a student from Lehigh, which is obviously a very prestigious university, students have a very big set of expectations laid upon us, not only with academics, but also with extracurricular activities. We are expected to excel in everything that we do, and we are expected to balance so many things at once, like a juggling act. And it can get really crazy, specifically with things such as theater. Theater is a wonderful community, but it is also a very time-consuming thing. And when you're balancing not only regular schoolwork, but actual work to help pay off student loans, buy books, feed yourself, it can get really crazy to balance theater on top of that. And so specifically, balancing everything, working for the Department of Theater has been a gift because they are very understanding in scheduling and conflicts. If I need to take a day, the Department of Theater has been very gracious, but it's the structure itself that can honestly send you into a mental and emotional tailspin at times.
Do you feel like your classwork is affected, or the way you perform in your academics is affected during Tech Week and during the run of a show?
Absolutely. There's no question about it. I know specifically our shows kind of line up around the schedule for exams and everything, because that's just how life goes. But gosh, when you're trying to study for 2 exams and you need to write 3 papers, maybe you have a big lab coming up and you need to piece out entire days to get work done for a show, it can be incredibly stressful. And honestly, it comes down to how much sleep are you willing to lose? How much stress are you willing to go through, and how nice is your professor and how understanding is your professor. Because the work needs to get done, but specifically with like 10 out of 12s and tech week, I mean, academics are why we are at school, but it feels like it gets in the way, and that's a tough thing to wrestle with.
So a lot of times I know directors or stage managers will say like, oh yeah, you can do your homework during the 10 out of 12. Do you think that's even slightly possible?
Okay, speaking from an acting perspective right now, you are not only worked to the bone, so the little time that you are not standing or sitting on stage is a gift for food or sleep or anything else, but to get homework done in a dark room where you're expected to be quiet and you don't know when you are going to be able to actually get work done, when you're going to be called on stage, how long a hold is going to last. Because while you're sitting on a hold, while the lighting designer is telling you don't move, you can't move because they need to get a shot done. And so it's not like you can whip out your laptop and start working on stuff. And specifically with things like group projects, that goes out the window because communicating and talking loudly or at all is just out the door when it comes to tech week and specifically 10 out of 12s. So it's, if you can manage to get studying or homework done while doing that, you are a talented person. And that's only speaking from an acting perspective, where if you are assisting the lighting designer or your backstage crew or anything else, your breaks are not breaks. Those are the moments where you are struggling to put out every fire in the house and to fix every little issue just so you can prepare for the run where you are also on standby. So it's a very complicated and very stressful experience.
So we talked to some other students, and one of the students suggested that due to the just sheer volume of time required, that might be a barrier for why some students don't want to do theater here at Lehigh, or maybe they don't want to do theater at all. Have you found that to be true, that you think the time commitment is a barrier?
100%. When I'm talking to first years at Lehigh, they ask about the experience, and they ask about the experience in theater and the scheduling, because you go into Lehigh knowing that classes and exams are going to be very rigorous. So it does put people off because they don't know if they are going to have enough time to do that. And you can't go in with any expectation other than this is going to take up a lot of my time. And I know I have actually had conversations with people where they will schedule classes around shows because they don't want to take a class that's going to be too time consuming, or the exam is going to be too difficult because they want to do a show. And that's a big risk people are willing to take, and that's a sacrifice people have to make in order to do theater. And not every major and not every person has the privilege of doing that.
That's really interesting there, Shaun, that you brought up privilege. The paragraph that I want to draw out of right now with the We See You White American Theater document states this demand and why. Eliminate 10 out of 12s and eliminate the 6-day rehearsal week. These are long-standing practices that are seeped in capitalist and white supremacist culture. When these practices are in place, the growing and nurturing of the BIPOC family structure is imperiled. Many BIPOC artists have been forced to make a choice not to have families. For Indigenous artists and other peoples recovering from genocide, these practices are extremely detrimental.
For anyone who doesn't know, BIPOC stands for, I think I mentioned it earlier, Black, Indigenous people of color, who are at the most disadvantage in our society right now. But we'll hear from David in just a moment.
Particularly in things like the 10 out of 12s, the 6-day work week, All those things are things that they're racist because they're not anti-racist, to put it bluntly. They are just practices that they're not only racist, they're sexist, they're classist, they are all those things. To be able to survive in a world that expects you to do multiple 10 out of 12s in 1 week, you need incredible resources to be able to do that. In our country, it is a sad fact that people of color don't have the same resources that white people do. So if you're requiring, generally, if you're requiring people to have a lot of personal resources, then only the people with those personal resources are going to be able to survive that. And the people who don't aren't. The same personal resources challenges affect people with disabilities. They affect people with children. They affect people with older parents in the home that they have to care for. They affect people with of lower socioeconomic status for whatever reason. These kinds of, show must go on, badge of honor sort of practices are really harsh on a lot of different populations. But they're very definitely racist, classist, sexist, all those things. People who have trouble getting to public transportation or ready access to good transportation have trouble getting home from a late call or a 10 out of 12 call. They have trouble making it to an early call or so these things can affect people of lots of different backgrounds negatively. And I really appreciate that we see what folks for calling those two out in particular, along with everything else they've called out, which is a spectacular document. Those two things, along with a lot of things in their document, are things that would really be better for everybody, not just for people of color. So why are we not doing these things? I mean, do we really want to keep the people of color down so much? I can't believe that's the reason we're doing these things. But that's the effect that these things are having. So we should really examine them and fix them.
So what David said was just really interesting. I feel like it's something that a lot of us in the theater industry can relate to on some wavelength. A lot of us have families, a lot of us have significant others, a lot of people, might not have access to public transportation, or they might not be able to take that much time out of their day without it affecting things really greatly. I know personally I have a lot of those struggles as someone who is of a lower socioeconomic class. So it's interesting, what he says about it affects everyone in different ways. And I feel like the only people that could benefit are clearly from that white men of financial security. So we all talked to different colleagues about their experiences.
I talked to a colleague of mine who works at a college as an educator and also as the technical director. And I can tell you his point of view on 10 out of 12s is, especially with his technicians, he takes care of them in terms of making sure they get their breaks. He's very adamant about his students. He kind of drew a line in the sand and said, my students are going to get their hour for lunch and their hour for dinner. I thought that was great that he's protecting them in that regard, right? He's get your rest in, take your break. But he's also instituted a policy over there that any notes he gets during tech, he will not address at tech. He tries to get his stuff done a week before tech. Everything is ready. Everything is done. They have tech, and he tells them, great, any notes that you have are now on my timetable, right? And he gets to them when he can, when he does. And so I don't think he's a fan of 10 out of 12s, but I think he's doing a really good job in making them work for him and making them work for his students as best he can. He's protecting them in their time. And I think that's the best he can do. And I think even doing that is a step in the right direction.
Sure. I think that's really interesting that he's not a fan, but he still keeps it as part, he's working out a way to make it work, I suppose is how you just put it. I know that there's a lot of folks in our midst that are kind of on the fence about, the positives and the negatives of what 10 out of 12s bring to the table and leave behind. One of the questions we had talked about, how do we get all of the work done if we limit our time, and I think that that's a really great question to ask ourselves. Can we accomplish what we would need to accomplish? Do we have to give up any of those creative choices? Do we have to curb things that might take more time? Is there a different way to approach it so that we can make our time more manageable and also get the work done that we, to see the project through to what we want to have on stage? Some people just prefer those longer days, those longer stretches. This idea that if I work one long day versus 2 short days, I'll have more time with my family because I get an entire day, or I might have more time with my significant other, or to go shopping and do my laundry or whatever it might be on that other day off if I don't split my days up. What do we think about that question?
So I think it is like, I can see their argument where they're coming from, that, if I can just work a 12-hour chunk, I get in the momentum, it keeps going. You think you might be more productive, you think you might get more done. But again, and something that we've talked about is that theater has so many constraints already. There's constraints of time, there's constraints of labor, there's constraints of budget. So we're already used to working within certain constraints. So all this is saying is, hey, we just have to impose one more. And since, every theater is so different, you might have a $200 budget at one theater and a $20,000 budget at another theater, and the art is still created, the art is still there. So whether you have 20 hours or 24 hours, and I mean, let's even talk about the fact that I don't think anyone thinks that tech is productive for 100% of tech. There's definitely times where the end of the night, everyone is getting grumpy. You just want to go home. Your brain is so just completely exhausted that you're not just trying to get it done. And there's, a saying in theater that sometimes done is better than good. But I definitely think we can have both. I definitely think that if we are conscious of each other's times and our own time, then we can say, like, okay, well, I have this time to get it done, and I'm going to be productive during these 6 hours as opposed to these 14 hours. And it might be the same result. It might be a better result. Sometimes people really work well under pressure. And that's just what it is. Opening night is going to happen no matter what. And you shouldn't work every possible second of tech to get that done. I definitely think you can give your brain a rest. You can't make art when you're exhausted.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I think we've all been coaxed into thinking that, if I can do it in 5 hours, I'll do it in 5 hours. Or if I think or I forecast that I need 7 hours, I'll use 7 hours. I always fill that time. And that could be through distraction, doing something else that maybe I have a longer conversation than I should with somebody, or something extra that I don't necessarily need to do in that 7-hour period. If I could trim some of that from my time, I'm certain I could probably fit it into less time. I think there's some things that will take time and that would have to be managed differently just because of the nature of whatever that is. If we're working on video and we're doing a video rendering project, that takes a certain amount of time to handle. But outside of those types of things, you really just have to kind of address from the other end in your head, I think, where you say, I have 5 hours to do this and I'm going to meet that deadline.
I think what's interesting too, I had a professor at college who, when we were working on our portfolios, he told us this quote by Da Vinci that said, art is never finished, it's only abandoned. And I'm sure Matt can attest to this. Sometimes the designer will just give you notes because they have time to give you notes. But if tech was a day shorter, you wouldn't have gotten those notes. So I think it's interesting that, if we give ourselves time as theater creators, we're just going to keep filling it no matter what. No matter how much time it is, we're going to fill it.
I feel like we find ourselves working up until opening, not even like on notes sometimes. And I wonder if there's a way to prepare for that and not do that, right? Like, I don't think we should look at Tech Week as the week where we need to cram and get everything done and we're going to be working late nights. Why can't we be done a week before tech? Is that a possibility?
David really brought a good point, I think, about how to restructure the way we think and plan for those weeks of tech, for those approaches in our production. One of the things he highlighted was that not all productions are the same. So it's really convenient for us to kind of pull back on that schedule because that's what we did last time, and pull back on another schedule because it's familiar. But instead, maybe moving forward, it's time to think about this production is going to need more time for this part and less time for that part. And maybe if we kind of rethink a little more on the structure of how we plan our time, then we can think also about better approaches to manage our time. And then we can still get the whole product done, but we've done it in a different way through just a little bit of extra pre-planning time. Here's what David shared with us about shortening the tech process at Carnegie Mellon.
So a longer number of days of tech process with shorter spans of each day, I think would, even if you're trying to keep the same number of hours, would still be better than working long days. Luckily, we didn't have to expand the number of days of tech because people just bought into the idea of doing less. But I think if people don't buy into the idea of doing less, I think the idea of doing the same amount spread out over more days is still a better idea.
And I mean, I think also when we consider what's at stake here, I think that's a big thing. You know, we're so concerned about getting the work done, but I don't think we're truly considering the stakes, you know, and that's what this whole podcast today is about work-life balance. And, you know, who's benefiting, who is harmed, how are they harmed? So that's great that people are concerned about putting on, you know, having the highest production value possible, but at what cost? And the cost that we're learning is it's the people. The cost is the people. We have people leaving the industry left and right. We have people that during COVID right now are deciding, hey, I finally have time off. And I've realized that like this isn't the industry for me because it's affecting my mental health. It's affecting my family. It's affecting my relationships. And I mean, personally, that's something I never realized was a problem, or I guess had time to even consider it in depth as a problem until now. So I think it's so important to talk about. And we're in the middle of this pandemic that people are really struggling. And I feel like we're in a time of greater empathy than we ever have been before, and trying to be gentle with each other. And I really hope that after seeing COVID, after seeing like, hey, we really need to prioritize human well-being in our industry and working from home and making these allowances for each other, that we can continue that when we go back into a full production season and seeing like, you know, saying like being vulnerable and saying like, hey, this is too many hours for me. I can't do it. Or, you know, hey, I don't know if you knew this about me, but I am not financially well off and I cannot do what you're asking me to do because of my situation. And not using it as like an excuse. That's just the reality. People come from different backgrounds, and that is a great thing about theaters, that it's supposed to be a big inclusive party. So we have to be more understanding of where everyone's coming from so we can all collaborate together and make this art.
Yeah, I think for far too long, we took things for granted. And I know I am certainly guilty of that. And I think this slowdown and this great pause that we're in right now has given us, at least for myself, has given me time to rethink how I want my life to be on the daily. Being locked in a house with my family for weeks on end was a significant gift. And it helped me realize, since I got to step off the train of the work that I was doing for a little while, it helped me realize that maybe I was taking those folks in my life for granted. They understand, right? They've always understood that the unspoken rule in our house is, well, I'm not going to see mom until tomorrow. So I'd kiss them goodbye at the bus, 7 a.m. I kiss them goodbye and I'll say, hey, I'll see you tomorrow. And that was a literal statement because I'm going to be going to work and coming home while they're at school. And then I would come home after they'd gone to bed. So I won't be seeing them till the next morning. Is that okay? Is it okay that I have the expectation that they should just be okay with not seeing their mom for the whole day? I don't know. I think that's the right question to ask. And I think that for far too long, we've taken it for granted that people should just understand rather than figuring out a way to work that into our structure and our patterns of planning.
Matt, how do you feel about your work-life balance?
I don't think it's balanced. I'm only at Lehigh 37 and a half hours a week. But for most of my time, and it is a 3/4 position, I carried a second job for the first 4 or 5 years. I worked at a restaurant on weekends. So work Monday through Friday and then work Saturday and Sunday. It was a different kind of work. So I never felt burnt out, but I was still working 7 days a week. I still had responsibilities. I never got to family events or missed holidays, or it just kind of, that's what it was though. That was my job. And I expected people to understand that. And it wasn't like, oh, hey, I should take this weekend off and go see somebody or go to a friend's house or go to a birthday party. It was, you should understand I have to work. And so it was almost ingrained in me that I was pushing myself. I wasn't allowing myself to be easy on me, right? So my work culture has always been go, 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 go. I don't work weekends anymore, but I still have responsibilities after I leave at 5 o'clock. Before everything's shut down, I wasn't getting home till after 10 o'clock at night most nights. So, you're up and at work by 9 and you're getting home at 10, and there's not a whole lot of time for anything else.
Can I ask you a question real quick?
Yeah.
So you do about 40 hours of physical labor. After you clock out at 5 o'clock each day, do you ever think about the shows that you're doing? Do you think about the work? Do you check your emails? Do you answer texts about questions during tech?
100%.
So you don't work only 37 and a half hours a week. That's what you're physically working there. But I mean, the mental labor doesn't stop.
Sure. There are many times I'll go home and I'm worried about a show, or I'm thinking about what the next step is going to be, or, oh man, I know we're behind. What can I get done in the morning? And I'm already planning my next steps out. Maybe I'm checking a drawing, and yeah. And especially, with cell phones, right? My phone is always around me. It's so easy to get lost in email and not even really think, hey, I shouldn't be looking at this right now. Right. It's just, especially during, tech weeks or when shows are getting ready to open, I feel like part of my responsibility is to stay on top of that. And it's honestly, it's not. But where do you draw that, and how do you draw that line? And for someone like me, that's very hard. I want to make sure I can do the best I can and that I do the job as well as I can. And so I'm willing to do that, but I shouldn't. I should be able to put that phone down, I feel like.
I think that brings us really nicely also into this idea in theater that it is the show must go on mentality, where if you don't do your part, the whole thing is going to fall apart. That's very ingrained in people, that if you call out of a rehearsal, or you have to leave tech early, or you feel this immense guilt of, if I leave, if I don't contribute 100% of everything I have in me, even if I'm sick, even if I'm unwell, even if a family member is sick and I'm mentally not in a good headspace to be there, it's an understanding, it's a known thing in the theater industry. You're expected to be there no matter what. No matter what's happening in your life, the show is taking priority. And that's a really dangerous mentality. And I'm sure we've all been there. I mean, Shaun, have you had any examples of times where you have needed to leave rehearsal and you felt like you had to be there? Any of that guilt?
Funny enough, there was a time I was doing a show where I was also taking on a leadership role within the cast. Right before tech happened, I had a family member pass away. I was heartbroken, but I knew that I could try and come to my director because she was a friend of mine. So I went to her and I explained the situation, and I said that I would have to miss a day because I was going to see her funeral, my aunt's funeral. Not only did I go in feeling guilty, I remember her specifically saying, well, I don't know what we're going to do because I had you scheduled for rehearsal that day. I didn't go. I did not go to my aunt's funeral because I felt so guilty that I was going to miss something in a rehearsal where I wasn't even doing anything. I remember it specifically, and I was so upset about it because we weren't doing any scenes for anything that I was a part of that day. But just in case I was needed, I had to be on call right then and there. And this is high school theater, mind you. This was my senior year. This was the last show I was ever going to be a part of in this production, but I couldn't miss one day because of a death in the family. On one hand, I wanted to be there so badly because it's, especially in my family, it's a big part of the mourning process. It's to say goodbye to your family. But I went to my mom and convinced her to let me stay home instead of going. And I think that was one of the worst parts about it, is the fact that I had it in my head that I needed to be there. And it doesn't stop there. I mean, it was a very sad moment for me, but we even see it at school. I remember people miss class because they're either too tired to go to classes, or they feel like they need a mental break, but they can't miss rehearsal. And that's a really tough thing to wrestle with, And it's with this idea that, I've been hearing this now more in the theater context, but in the context of, our world, is that COVID did not create all of these issues for us. It's that COVID showed us that there were all these issues going around, and it brought it to light, whether it was making us stay at home and showing us, wow, I can actually do these things at home where I don't need to overwork myself for 14 hours a day or for 50, 60 hours a week. It showed us how vulnerable and how much we were being taken for granted. That's a tough conversation to have in theater specifically, especially with a show must go on mentality, because we are meant to create so much and we're supposed to be on the ball.
And I think the stakes, Shaun, to add on top of that, are that there's so many people who want that job. There's so many other people that you could be replaced with easily. So there's this kind of guilt factor, but also this fear factor that plays into that, I could replace you in a heartbeat moment, to make us make that choice against something that we would never choose to not do, never choose.
Mm-hmm. I think it's weird that theater is one of the few instances where, in some cases, you are literally teaching your replacement or a potential replacement. And on one hand, it's good. Like, if I can't be there, there's someone who can fill those shoes for me. But on the other hand, it's like a constant threat of, there is someone who can and will replace you if you can't be there. And it might not just be for one day that you can't be there. It's, if you don't come to this, if you don't show up, if you aren't prepared, you will no longer be a part of this. And that's not just from an acting standpoint, that's from a stage crew, from any type of crew. And it's a really toxic environment to be in sometimes.
Elizabeth, would you like to share any of your experiences with the show must go on mentality?
Sure. How many times, I think the question, so there were a couple things that Matt said that made me think I can relate to that, like the 6-day work week that I live in, for most of my time, is that day off really a day off? That's one question I would put out there. I know Matt suggested that he doesn't necessarily like mentally shift out of his job if he's worried about a show. I know that my husband expects me to be on my email and checking my email and responding and doing work on my day off, all the time. Or conversely, if I've just done a 10 out of 12 or a 14-hour day or a 16 or 18-hour day, whatever, then I lose the next day altogether because of physical exhaustion. I just have to rest. I don't have the energy to, or the motivation to do anything the next day. I have to recover. As far as the show must go on mentality, I have a couple of prime examples. One of which is bringing. I had a case of food poisoning, and I was running a temperature of over 102. I had a toddler who was under 2 years old, and my husband had food poisoning worse than I did. And I had to show up to my job with my child on my back in a backpack with running a fever. She was fine. I wasn't. I'd been up half the night, being sick. And I came into work and worked an entire, probably a 10 or 12-hour day with this toddler and trying to just keep myself together. I think the bigger incident for me was pretty, I would call it catastrophic. In hindsight, I can't believe it took me this long to figure it out, but the show must go on mentality. At the end of my mother's life, she went down pretty quickly, and she lived in Nebraska, and I lived in Pennsylvania, and I was trying to figure out how I could get home to see her before she passed away. And I just kept telling my family, I was in really close contact with my family for obvious reasons, as her decline was happening. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna be on my way, but I have to get through this weekend of events. It's the last thing I have to manage, and then I can be on my way. And I was planning to head out to Nebraska the moment I was done with the second of those 2 days of events, and I missed it. My mother did not wait, so that's on me. But that's something that, part of that show must go on mentality, that guilt of leaving other people in a lurch. That's all me. That was my brain saying, you can't do that. You can't give that management, that time, that whatever. You can't burden somebody else with what you should be doing. That's part of that internalized guilt of what we do and how we behave and what we think in our job roles. And that's pretty tragic.
What about you, Bailey?
I mean, I feel like I've definitely worked on more than one production where there are buckets backstage because there's a flu going around the entire cast and crew, and there's puke buckets backstage in case anyone needs to run off stage to throw up. There's definitely been instances of that in my life. I missed my brother's college graduation because I was working a dance recital. So not even a show, just a normal dance recital I was just backstage for, but they couldn't find anyone to replace me in time. And his graduation had, it was like the rain check date, the rain cancellation date. So I couldn't plan it ahead of time. So yeah, I have tons of examples of shows that I've worked on where, maybe someone, I worked on a show where the actor, one of the leads, broke his leg, and instead of rescheduling, the playwright was part of the company. They wrote it into the script why he had a broken leg on stage, instead of just saying like, hey, we have plenty of time to re-rehearse with like a new person or do adjust blocking or something. Like, they just had him go on stage with like a leg that had been broken for like 3 days, which is super dangerous. That's people need to rest. Their bodies need to recover. I've had plenty of friends that had food poisoning or illnesses or an unknown illness that they could easily get everyone else sick, that they were just like, okay, we'll just like try to avoid people, instead of saying like, hey, you're not well and we care about you as a human, so why don't you take a couple days off and we'll figure it out. There's never any like, we'll figure it out, and especially not any we'll figure it out without like a guilt trip accompanying it. So that's, and you hear, it's not just like our personal stories, it's in the professional world. Like, artists don't frequently cancel their tours if they're like a big musician that's touring. if someone's sick. I feel like Ariana Grande was one of the first people to do it, and it was like a big uproar. We had talked a little bit about in the entertainment industry, in professional wrestling, wrestlers get hurt constantly. Constantly they get hurt. They get heavily concussed. They get really injured. There was a wrestler, and not even like years ago, I'm talking like a month ago, a wrestler fell off a truck and smacked his head on the concrete, was clearly concussed on TV, clearly stumbling around, bleeding from his head. They tried to stop the match. The ref tried to stop the match, and he was gone for 15 seconds and came back, and they were like, the doctor cleared him. He's fine. But he had to go to the hospital directly after that match because, you know, he was so concussed, but they wanted to let the match finish. The show had to go on. Even though we all know it's fake, we all know theater is not really happening on stage. You know, the stakes are pretty low in terms of, you know, we need to take a pause, or we need to cancel, or we need to reschedule. You know, it's not like we're in the middle of brain surgery and the surgeon has the sniffles and they're rescheduling, that person's going to die on the table. But it comes down to money. Exactly. Elizabeth is doing the little money rub in hand. It is. That's the only stakes that there are. And time and time again, it's proven that money and the thought of having to refund audience tickets or reschedule audience tickets matters more than the lives of the people that are on stage.
So I'd be interested to find out how we interrupt that process. How do we interrupt this? How do we meet the demand put forth in the WCU White American Theater? How do we eliminate 10 out of 12s? Is it doable? Can we do that? I think we can.
Yes, we can.
I think we can. You know, David had some great insight into why they decided to eliminate them. Let's hear a little bit about the implementation of how that happened.
Main concern at the school is for the student director's experience and their learning. The response from the faculty was, yeah, let's just do less hours. This is crazy. The late hours of a 10 out of 12 day, the last couple hours of that day are kind of useless anyway. Why are we putting ourselves and everybody through it? Let's just stop doing that. And then when I asked the follow-up question of, do we then need to add hours someplace else? The answer was no, we'll just do it in less hours. So we will figure out how many hours we have for tech and create the show within the box that we've got and not try to push the box further than it can be, which I thought was a really great response.
So we just heard from David about how we can get rid of it from Carnegie Mellon School of Drama, which has actually done it. And he has seen really great results. And he only implemented a year ago, but they've already seen really great results in their students and the faculty and the staff. You know, everyone seems much happier and healthier. I think it's really important that we start this in the generations to come so they can maybe avoid some of the long-term effects that those of us who have been in the industry a little bit longer, or even, you know, Shaun, how long have you been doing theater?
For about 6 or 7 years.
Okay, 6 or 7 years. And I don't know if you feel this too, Shaun, but a lot of the research that we found from people, I interviewed a couple of my friends who are millennials, and they come from different backgrounds and they're in different parts of the country. But what they've found is that theater has really affected them in the long term. A lot of them are getting out of the industry because of the anxiety that they feel, the guilt that they feel, the show must go on mentality. Like Elizabeth was saying, when you work a 6-day week, that one day off, you're trying to rest. You're trying to, you know, you just worked all week, so you want to have like a fun day. So you have that FOMO, the fear of missing out, where you're like, well, I have to do all my fun stuff because I don't have time during the week. But you're also trying to get all your household chores done. So it's an impossible mountain to climb of the amount of things that you're trying to get done in your one day off. And there's also this huge anxiety that a lot of people feel where they value their own lives against the productivity that they're putting out. I know I feel this a lot, where on my days off or when I have time off, I feel guilty. I feel like I need to be cramming it with house projects or doing something or enriching my life in another way because it's only theater, that I feel like any hobby I have to do, like I have to do it and it's constant, or then I get so overwhelmed that I don't do any of it at all. And it's a really, you know, it's a very like dark cloud that follows you around.
It really is. I have to just throw in what you've just said really really resonates with me. In my household, my family have a long running joke about how, mom is going to do all of these things. And I always come up with a to-do list that's about, 2 or 3 months worth of stuff that I want to do in that one day. And it just keeps adding every week. I just keep adding more things that I want to add on that list. And I never get anything done. It's really hard, and it makes it impossible. It's almost like getting into a rut where you just it's really difficult to break that. Some of the notes that I took from our research team, one of the people that we were interviewing out of Chicago was talking about how the 10 out of 12s seem to breed stress. And along with that, it sort of breeds the divas, right? And I think the divas really in this case is part of something else we see from the whole work-life balance being off kilter, is that idea that I've worked this many hours and then we kind of one up each other. So I've worked 16 hours, but maybe Matt comes in and says, well, that's fine, but I worked 18 hours. It's sort of presented as a badge of honor. To me, that is the wrong approach in our thinking of how that should work. Again, I go back to, if we limited ourselves to a 6-hour day, we could probably accomplish it if we just eliminated the waste time that isn't important to getting the job done.
Yeah, and especially since, like we've mentioned before, when it comes to a 14-hour day or a 6-hour day, no matter how long the day is, you're going home with homework, whether that's a structured thing or, as an actor, I'm constantly running through my lines and thinking about every scene and thinking about every which way I could say every single line. And it's tough because I'm constantly battling what I think is best, or what the director's vision is, or researching what the hell am I even saying. And it's really tough. So I think we put too much on ourselves at times, and we force ourselves into this competitive nature. Theater is competition, and it can be a very toxic environment at times. But specifically in what you were saying with constantly trying to outdo one another and prove that you're working the hardest for some imaginary competition, which quite honestly may determine our jobs, our careers, which roles we get, and how we climb this ladder. And it's at times very ridiculous.
And I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, but I feel for people who don't come from this background, especially, we're in college, we're in educational theater, and if we're trying to pull in non-majors, or if non-majors want experience, oh, this sounds fun, or theater, or even if I'm going to work backstage crew, I don't have to go through the rehearsal process. And then they get to the point where it's like, oh, for the next 2 weeks, I have no time to go to class or do homework, or I think it's very easy for them to walk away. I think it's very easy for them to get overwhelmed. And I think it's very easy for them to lose track of all this because they don't understand what it is they're signing up for. And I think you can sit and tell them the schedule, and that's fine, but they don't understand what that truly means, having never done it for 2 weeks straight. How do you bring in these people from outside then if we make it this hard? How there has to be a way to make that bridge easier to cross.
Someone else that we had interviewed, they have a really great quote, so I'm just going to share that real quick. I've directed a good number of plays outside the academic world with artists who do this one thing only and don't also have 4 o'clocks, which are the exams at Lehigh, quizzes during the day, and so on. They would never tolerate rehearsing every evening after work, and on top of that, doing endless texts, which I think is a true testament, for myself and Elizabeth and Matt, this is our full-time job. And for the students, being a student should be their full-time job. And yet we're piling on another full-time job of theater on top of them. And it's very unforgiving.
Yeah, I think to just add to that, another one of the quotes that I found really interesting was, I chose to commit a huge amount of time to theater, but at Lehigh specifically, people tend to expect you to put all of your energy into theater. And the majority of our students involved in theater are not theater majors. As an engineer, I had an incredibly difficult time juggling class and theater. I can't even imagine what it would be like if I had a job or I was a work study. So they felt a lot of privilege being able to choose that, even though they had a really tricky schedule to balance with that. And I think that that is really part of the heart of the matter, right? With the We See You What document, it precludes a lot of individuals from participating at all. One of the interviews I watched a few weeks ago included some information about the idea that maybe an indigenous person isn't able to fit into the theater culture because they would never in their life make the choice that I made, make the choice that Shaun made about foregoing something that culturally would just be way too significant for them to ever make that kind of a decision. So it just kind of puts them on the outside and they'll never be able to make that connection to theater.
Absolutely. And I also think it was really important, the point that you made, that part of this conversation we're having, although it is an important conversation to have, part of this conversation is also rooted in our own privileges, where we're talking about balancing, home life with theater. Or I'm talking about, as a student, it's really hard balancing schoolwork with rehearsals and tech week and stuff like that. But not just that, a lot of students are working almost full time, whether that be with work study or they're doing off campus jobs. And I'm very privileged to work for the Department of Theater, where they are very understanding in that if I have a tech day, I might not be able to go to work. Or during tech week, I might just be able to sit down and do homework or catch up on studying or something. But for the majority of people, that is not the case. They are balancing a million things at once and having to provide for yourself, and not only to stay at the academic level to stay at the university, but also at the financial level where you can afford to stay at this university, afford housing, afford food and clothing and rent. It's a mind-boggling thing to talk about.
I've never considered the ability that I have to do theater a privilege. It was just something I could do and did, and I've never sat and thought about what that means, what that translates to. And it is, I've had a very privileged opportunity to be where I am and to end up here. And I don't know, it's that was never a thought that crossed my mind. So this whole series has been very eye-opening for me.
So how do we change? It's definitely, we need to change the culture, right? We need to change the culture of the entire industry. And how do we do that? I mean, sure, we could go in, full speed and walk into these theaters like the We See You What document and say, these are our demands. This is what has to happen. And that's great that they're doing that. And it's definitely, we're in a time of cancel culture where if theaters aren't going to get on board with that, that's the consequences. But I think David had some really interesting thoughts about how they're planning on changing the industry, planting seeds, influencing the future generation. I think we're in really good hands with the Z's of today, that they want to make change and they want their lives to be better and they're less okay with being complicit. So let's hear what David has to say.
If they get into the professional world, they may experience those things, but we don't feel that we have to put them through that. There's no need to build up their stamina. We build up the students' stamina with all the other stuff we throw at them already anyway. We don't also have to pile on with a 10 out of 12 to figure out whether they've got stamina to make it through a rehearsal process and a tech process. They've got that. I have no worry about them on that. But the other thing I would say, I think has been driving me and others, certainly around the CMU School of Drama, is that we've realized in the relatively recent past few years, that the way to change the industry isn't to wag our fingers at the industry. It is to change the expectations of the people who are entering the industry, so that when they enter the industry with a different expectation of where the industry should meet them. They've already got different expectations about where the industry should meet them, just because they are, at this point, they're a different generation of people and they have different ideas, which is great for them and great for the industry because it's pushing us. And, if we can feed in additional ideas like this to their toolkit of expectations, I think it's great.
So, Shaun, you're our Z. How are you going to make a difference in the industry?
Well, it starts by having conversations exactly like this. And it's about bringing people who are most vulnerable into these conversations, because it's really easy to talk about this from a privileged perspective and say, oh, these are issues that I hear are happening. I haven't seen them myself, so I don't know it all, but here's my take on it. But bringing people who are on the outskirts, who are the most vulnerable and who are the most taken advantage of in these situations and these spaces, and it's hearing them and hearing what they need from us and developing a culture where it isn't working people to the bone and forcing everyone into this competition where it's just, it can be class competition over and over again, where those who are in a higher class or in a higher social standing or anything else are the only ones who have the privilege of doing theater. And by pointing out these flaws and making theater more accessible for people and providing funding and opportunity for people who are disadvantaged, that's the way to start it. But because I am not those people, I don't have all the answers. But I guess it starts with learning and listening.
That's really great to hear.
Bailey, how are you going to address these issues in the future?
So from a millennial perspective, I'm not super into my career, and a lot of the power comes from people in the hierarchy. But I think for people who are just starting out, I think you have to start demanding whatever you can demand, and that looks different for everyone. Not everyone is at a position to leave a job that they don't want to be at or they think is treating them unfairly. So I think it is just making waves in the little ways you can. I've been at Lehigh for 4 years now, so I feel like I have a little bit of a voice. I'm not super new, and I feel like I'm in a position where I've established myself enough that I can start making some waves or making suggestions or making changes in my department at large, and hopefully that ripple effect will continue outwards wherever I continue with my career.
That's great. How about you, Matt?
I think one of the most important things you can do is set boundaries, and I think it's important for people to do that for themselves, for their own well-being, for their own sanity, for their own mental health, right? Is to the best of your ability, learn to say no when you can, and set your own personal boundaries with your job or your passion and let that stand, right? Once you set a boundary, you have to stick to it. But if you work, maybe you can start shifting some culture by just setting boundaries for yourself or for others.
That's great.
What are your thoughts on that, Elizabeth?
What does the elder of the group think?
The elder. Listen to that ageism.
That is a dangerous way to start a conversation.
What does our X think? The X marks the spot. What are we doing?
Gen X. From the Gen X perspective, I'm in a different place in my career, and I think for me, it's all about personally educating myself and then learning what I can to model that behavior so that others might be drawn to change and adjust their own behavior. the more I can learn, the more I can educate. I have all summer I've spent hours in workshops and Zoom meetings and gatherings with other individuals in our industry across the states and across the world. And I am just soaking up so much information and knowledge and trying to help not only myself turn a corner, but I'm hoping to kind of get all the information in hand so that I can start helping others turn those corners as well. There's a lot of people who are stuck in a rut of thinking, and I'm here to try and break that pattern of thinking. And then also, of course, because I teach here, to plant those seeds for our future generations so that we can start shifting that and moving that needle to the new way of our new world order.
I love that. So that's what we're going to do, everyone. So we want you all to think about, what are you going to do? How are you going to help the theater industry?
Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you to David Holcomb and Shaun McNulty for being a part of this. Thank you to Phil Engel for writing this amazing music you're hearing. And thank you, Lehigh University Department of Theater, for sponsoring this podcast.
Our next show will be Sitting Ovation on November 11th, a podcast revealing who the interesting people who work in theater are, what they do, and why they do it. And keep an eye out for Theater XYZ Encore, a bonus episode where we'll be posting the full interview with my friend David Holcomb.
Find and like us on Instagram and Facebook at LU Theater, that's theater ending with an R-E, at LU Theater Podcast Series, and on Spotify. Just search Sitting Ovation and give us a follow. Catch you next time.
Bye!
Bye.
Bye.